Imagine a civilization at the absolute peak of its wealth and technological prowess. We're talking about a society carving these impenetrable mansions directly into solid mountains.
Right, just completely convinced of their own invincibility.
Exactly. I mean, they have engineered lush gardens, they control the water supply, and they've built this massive economic machine that just, well, concentrates unimaginable wealth right at the very top.
Yeah, and they look at their empire and think, we did it. We've solved the problem of survival. We are permanent.
Right. And they are completely unaware that a single, like a remarkably simple audit of their local water supply is about to trigger their total civilizational collapse.
It's a terrifying scenario, honestly, because it highlights this blindness that is just baked into highly complex, highly stratified societies.
Oh, absolutely.
When a system is entirely geared toward extraction, I mean, the architects of that system often completely lose the ability to perceive structural risk. They basically mistake their temporary monopoly for, a law of nature.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you, the listener, into a highly specialized analysis of a text that holds the keys to understanding that exact kind of civilizational survival and failure.
Yeah, but we do need to set some ground rules right off the bat here.
For sure. If you're tuning in expecting a conversation about theology, ancient history, or, some kind of spiritual sentimentality, you are definitely in the wrong place. We are stripping all of that away today.
We really are. We're establishing an entirely different intellectual framework for you. So, the source material we're dissecting today is an extensive analysis by Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Right. Specifically, his analysis of Surah 26 of the Quran, the Ash-Shu'ara section.
Exactly. And this is the key, Parwez does not read this text like a theologian. He reads it like a master sociologist or a systems engineer.
A systems engineer, yes.
We're going to look at this text to understand its social operating system.
Which means the prophets described in this text, right, particularly the figure of Saleh interacting with the society of Thamud, they are not depicted as mystical figures doing magic tricks in the desert to prove some religious point.
No, not at all.
In this structural reading, they are structural engineers. They are independent system auditors trying to identify and fix a fatal, catastrophic bug in the economic architecture of their societies before the whole thing just crashes under its own weight.
I like to think of it as debugging a massive, incredibly complex piece of software. I mean, if you have a fatal memory leak in your code, it really doesn't matter how beautiful the user interface is.
Right, the system is eventually going to freeze and crash.
Precisely. The figures in this text are basically pointing out the memory leaks in the socio-economic structure.
Which means we need to start this deep dive with a massive paradigm shift. And honestly, we have to just explode a myth right out of the gate here.
We really do.
Because if you're listening to this, you might have heard the conventional story of Saleh and the Thamud. And the centerpiece of that story is arguably the most misread symbol in this entire narrative, the she-camel.
Oh, yeah. The Naqad Allah.
Yes, the Naqad Allah mentioned in verses 155 and 156.
The conventional reading fundamentally misunderstands the actual mechanism of the narrative. I mean, the myth passed down usually goes something like this. God creates a miraculous, magical she-camel out of a solid rock just to prove a point.
Right, a literal magic trick.
Yeah. And then the people of Thamud, in their sheer arrogance, decide to kill this magic camel. And because they destroyed a supernatural artifact, God sends down this, supernatural lightning strike to smite them all.
It operates exactly like a fantasy novel.
It does. And Parwez argues that reading is exactly, 100% backwards.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second before we go further. Isn't it a bit anachronistic to map 20th century anti-capitalist, antitrust language onto a 7th century text?
That's a fair question.
How does Parwez justify using terms like productive commons or economic enclosure for, ancient nomadic pastoralists or early agrarian societies?
It definitely feels anachronistic at first, right? Until you actually look at the physical reality of how early agrarian wealth functioned. In antiquity, land and water were the entire capital structure.
Right. There were no stock markets or digital assets back then.
Exactly. The fundamental mechanism of wealth accumulation was literally the control of grazing land and water access. So Parwez isn't projecting modern capitalism backward.
Oh, I see.
He's just recognizing that the underlying physics of human resource monopoly operate on the exact same logic, whether you are hoarding a desert spring in antiquity or enclosing digital data today.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So when we strip away the supernatural veneer, what is the actual nature of the test involving this she-camel?
Well, we have to look at the literal text of the instruction given to the society. It reads, Hadi nakatu Allahi lakomiyatan fadoruta takufaret yalla.
And that translates to,
It translates to, this is a she-camel from God, a sign for you, leave her to eat from God's earth. And the linguistic key to unlocking this entire operating system lies in that last phrase, Art Allah, which means God's earth.
so in this socioeconomic framework, God's earth is not like a theological statement about divine real estate.
No, not at all.
It means the common land.
Right.
It is the productive commons. It's the shared ecological resource that belongs to the community as a whole, not to any private individual.
Exactly. It's the ultimate public trust. So when the text says, leave her to eat from God's earth, it is not outlining some religious ritual involving a sacred animal.
It's laying down a property rights specification.
Yeah, a very strict one. The instruction is telling the elite of the Thamud society, the grazing land and the water sources are not yours to enclose. You cannot draw a fence around the natural productive commons and claim exclusive private ownership over the literal lifeblood of the community.
Wow. So the she-camel is essentially the physical representation of the public sector.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a biological stress test for the society's property laws, which means the real crime of the Thamud, the actual reason their civilization collapsed, was not some vague arrogance toward a magical sign.
Yeah.
Their failure was the privatization of common productive resources. They committed the most precise economic crime described in this entire surah. They enclosed the commons.
And when a society decides to harm or kill the representative of the commons, they are structurally declaring that private ownership supersedes public survival. I mean, they are deciding to starve the system at its base just to feed a microscopic elite at the top.
If you're listening to this and thinking, wait, how can a society just vote to destroy its own foundational resources?
Yeah, it sounds crazy, right?
Right, but just consider how often modern corporations prioritize quarterly profits over long-term ecological survival. I mean, it is the exact same operating logic. You extract maximum value today, even if it basically guarantees a system-wide collapse tomorrow.
And fixing that requires a very specific kind of auditor. The text is incredibly deliberate in how it introduces Saleh, the messenger who brings this audit to the Thamud.
Okay, let's get into Saleh.
Surah 26, specifically verse 142, establishes this recurring pattern. The text refers to the messenger as a brother, or a kuhum.
So Saleh wasn't a foreigner. He wasn't some outsider dropping in with a completely alien philosophy. He grew up right there in the Thamud society.
Exactly, and being an insider is a structural requirement for a true systemic audit. Saleh knew the system inside and out because he was raised within its cultural conditioning.
Right, he knew exactly where the bodies were buried.
He really did. He knew where the vulnerabilities were, and he understood the specific mechanisms the elite used to manipulate the economic architecture. He managed to step out of the cognitive dissonance of his own culture to diagnose a fatal error that literally everyone else had normalized.
And to maintain his credibility as an insider diagnosing a corrupt system, there is one thing he absolutely cannot do. Verse 145 explicitly states that Saleh, like other messengers, asks for no wage or compensation for his message. He says he wants no ajar.
And this refusal of compensation is not just some display of pious humility. I mean, it is a non-negotiable functional requirement for an independent auditor operating within a corrupt system.
Let's frame this with a modern parallel for you, the listener. If you are brought in to audit a massive, notoriously corrupt corporation, you cannot be on their payroll.
Obviously not.
The moment you accept a salary or a consulting fee or stock options from the existing economic structure, you are compromised. By refusing any compensation from the Thamud's economic engine, Saleh makes himself entirely incorruptible. He literally cannot be bought off by the 1%.
Now think about the psychological threat this poses to the elite class, which the text refers to as the mutrafine.
The mutrafine, right.
In a society where power is entirely derived from monopolizing resources, the elite operate on a very simple assumption. Everyone has a price. The entire social fabric is held together by the belief that anyone can be bought, bribed, or intimidated into compliance if you control access to the necessities of life.
The system relies on everyone being complicit, even if they are victims of it. They need the lower classes to aspire to become the exploiters.
Exactly. So when a figure emerges from within, a brother who cannot be bought, who publicly refuses all compensation, and who actively advocates for the restoration of the common land, I mean, that person is an existential threat to the psychological foundation of the elite's power.
I can't tolerate him.
They absolutely cannot tolerate an uncompromised auditor because his very existence proves that their wealth is derived from systemic theft, not merit or, divine right.
This brings us to the actual execution of the audit. Like, how do you prove to a deeply propagandized society that their system is failing? The text mentions the she-camel as an ayatan, a sign, in verses 154 and 155. Saleh is basically challenged to prove his validity as a messenger.
Yes, and Parwez argues vigorously against the translation of ayatan as some spectacular demonstration of supernatural power in this context.
So what is it then?
It functions as an economic boundary marker.
It's a visible social contract. I mean, think about how abstract an economic system can be. Even today, you can't just point to inflation or wealth inequality in a way that forces a society to immediately change its behavior.
Right, those are slow, invisible processes.
Yeah, exactly. But you can point to a physical animal requiring access to a physical well. The she-camel takes the abstract concept of systemic exploitation and localizes it into a single, undeniable physical test.
Yes.
Will the community respect the common resource, allowing equal access to water and land, or will they privatize it and kill the representative of the commons?
It forces the society to physically enact its own operating logic in broad daylight. There's no hiding from it. But the implementation of this test comes with a very specific, highly consequential warning.
Right, the warning.
Saleh says, La tamasoa bisuin fa yakudokum atabuyamina o. Do not touch her with harm, lest a painful punishment of a great day seize you.
Okay, we have to dismantle another massive supernatural interpretation right here. The phrase Yom Om, the great day. Because the traditional mythological reading treats this as a mystical judgment day, like Sire falling from the sky to smite the wicked for being mean to a magic camel.
Yeah, that's the common myth. But from a systems engineering perspective, Yom is the structural reckoning. It is the inevitable mathematical result of the privatization of common productive resources. It is literal physics, the physics of economics asserting itself.
I really want to dig into that concept, the physics of economics, because it makes me think of gravity.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, you can ignore gravity, you can write laws saying gravity doesn't exist, but if you walk off a cliff, the physics just take over.
Are you saying the text treats economic inequality as a natural law with an inescapable physical reaction? That is precisely the framework Parwez is using. Think of a society like a massive power grid. The productive commons, the water, the land, that's the electricity that powers the entire grid.
Okay, I'm following.
The elites of the Thamud were essentially plugging thousands of massive private energy drains into a public grid while actively cutting the wires to the lower-class neighborhoods.
Wow.
So the Great Day's punishment isn't a deity throwing a lightning bolt at a bad person. It is the inevitable moment the transformers overheat and just explode.
Right, the system can't take the load.
Exactly. When common land is enclosed, the base of the community is robbed of its resilience. The masses are excluded from production, and a community that cannot access its own commons literally cannot sustain its own weight. It collapses inward. The punishment is baked right into the crime itself.
But people aren't blind.
Right.
The elites of the Thamud had to know their system was causing immense friction. If you're starving your own workforce, you see the cracks in the foundation.
Right.
So why didn't they just pivot? Why didn't they alter their economic behavior when confronted by this audit?
Because of the psychological armor they had built around themselves. And this is detailed brilliantly in the text just before the she-camel is introduced. In verses 153 and 154, the community issues a challenge to Saleh.
Right.
They say, you are only one of those bewitched Musa Arina. You are nothing but a human like us. Bring a sign if you are truthful.
Why do they want a sign? Like, why do they demand a spectacle from him?
This is the strategy of dismissal. It's so common. A community deeply invested in a corrupt system demands spectacular magical evidence precisely because magical evidence can always be written off as a hoax.
Entertain us, magic man, so we don't have to look at our wealth inequality.
Exactly. If he performs a magic trick, the elite can just hire better magicians or claim mass hysteria or just write him off as a sorcerer. Magic does not challenge the economic baseline. It serves as a distraction. It's just bread and circuses.
But structural evidence, a real-world economic test, cannot be faked, and it cannot be ignored.
No, it can't.
Which is why Saleh's counter-move with the she-camel is so brilliant. He completely refuses the demand for a magical spectacle. He doesn't do a dance or pull off an illusion. He offers the most direct, unavoidable test possible. I am placing the representation of the commons right here in the public square.
Yes.
Will your community respect shared property, or will your systemic greed force you to privatize and destroy it?
There is no manufacturing this result. The Thamud either leave the she-camel alone, proving their system can actually tolerate public goods, or they destroy her, proving their system is fatally extractive. It forces their hand entirely.
And notice how the text handles the result of this test. It is an absolute masterclass in deliberate textual compression. Verse 157 reports their decision in a single word. Fa-akoria. They hamstrung her.
Just one word. There is no drawn-out courtroom drama.
None. There is no long debate recorded about the specifics of the weapon used or the time of day.
And that compression highlights the systemic finality of the act. The test was simple. The failure was complete. The consequence was immediate. The economic decision to enclose the commons was made, and the structural consequence, the collapse, was instantly locked in.
It's like crossing the Rubicon.
Exactly. In systems theory, once a fatal parameter is breached, the collapse is already happening, even if the building hasn't hit the ground yet. The moment they hamstrung the camel, their social operating system crossed the event horizon of its own destruction.
Let's talk about the specific physical reality of the world the Thamud built, because it makes their failure and their blindness even more poignant. Verses 147 and 148 describe lush gardens, springs, and date palms with soft, heavy fruit.
Yeah, a true paradise.
And then verse 149 notes that they carved elaborate palaces into the mountains. And the specific Arabic word used here is fariyan.
Yes, fariyin. The linguistic root of that word unlocks their entire psychological architecture. They weren't carving into mountains because they lacked lumber or needed basic shelter from the elements. The word implies an action taken out of arrogance, exultation, and a psychological need to display absolute dominance over the environment.
It's the illusion of permanence. It's the classic billionaire bunker mentality, isn't it?
Well, 100%.
You extract so much wealth from the system that you convince yourself you are immune to the system's collapse. You build a fortress of stone and think, I have physically conquered the landscape. Therefore, my economic model will last forever.
It is the delusion that extreme wealth accumulation equates to civilizational immortality. But, their wealth was built on a very fragile, highly localized monopoly. In this agrarian society, the ultimate bottleneck for power was the monopoly on water.
Oh, the water wars.
Hmm.
This is where the geography of ancient societies becomes vital to understand. I mean, in a desert or semi-arid environment, if you control the spring, you control the population, period.
Exactly. And the concept of water rights, Shurb Malem, is central here. A water monopoly physically functions by drawing literal boundaries around the life source.
Yeah.
The elites were claiming the springs and the life-giving water exclusively for their own livestock, their own massive agricultural operations, their own profit centers. They were cutting off the lifeblood of the lower classes, whose small herds would die without access, basically forcing them into deeper subjugation.
And this is where Parwez introduces what we could call the fundamental economic equation of this text. God's earth plus God's servants equals equal access.
It's such a powerful equation. It is the ultimate formula for a sustainable, resilient social operating system. When the instruction was given that the she-camel must be allowed to drink from the water and eat from the earth, it was establishing the legal precedent that the Earth's foundational resources are a shared dividend.
They're not a private monopoly.
Right. God's Earth is the ultimate public trust, and any system that violates this equation is inherently unstable.
So we have established that the physics of this economy guaranteed a collapse, and the Thamud completely violated the equal access equation by hamstringing the camel.
Mm-hmm.
This triggers a mechanism Parwez calls the law of requital, or mukafat A. We really need to expand heavily on this because it is the core engine of the entire philosophy we're discussing today.
The law of requital must be understood with absolute structural precision. We really need to strip away any lingering ideas of mystical karma or, a supernatural scorecard keeping track of good and bad deeds for the afterlife.
No scorecards here.
None. Mukafat Amal is systemic physics. It is the inescapable mechanics of cause and effect in sociology and economics. Every single action a society takes generates a structural consequence that absolutely tracks that society.
So let's walk through the actual step-by-step mechanism of this collapse under the law of requital. How do you go from enclosing a well to a society completely eating itself? Give us the tangible mental model.
Let's track the chain reaction. Step 1. The elites block access to the productive commons. They hamstring the camel, asserting absolute private property rights over the water and grazing land.
Okay, step 1 is enclosure.
Right. Step 2. The immediate consequence falls on the lower classes. Because they can no longer access the grazing land or the water, their livestock, which is their only source of independent wealth and survival, begins to weaken and die.
Which leads to step 3, the loss of purchasing power. The lower classes no longer have goods to trade. They are economically neutralized.
Exactly. And that brings us to step 4, systemic stagnation. An economy requires circulation to survive. When the vast majority of the population loses their purchasing power, the local economy just grinds to a halt.
Right.
The elites might have massive reserves of wealth in their mountain palaces, but the daily velocity of money and goods outside those palaces completely dies.
Which triggers step 5, the buildup of intense, volatile social resentment. I mean, the lower classes are now actively starving while looking up at the farihin, the arrogant mountain mansions.
And finally, step 6, the infrastructure fails. Because who do you think was maintaining those lush gardens, tending the date palms, and building those mountain palaces?
The very labor force that the elites just starved.
Precisely. You cannot maintain a complex, highly engineered society when the vast majority of the population has absolutely no stake in its survival and barely has the calories to survive day to day.
The painful punishment, the adhab, is this internal fragmentation. It is the collapse of a social system whose economic architecture has become purely extractive.
Yes.
The elites appropriated the future productive capacity of the entire system for their own immediate benefit, and in doing so, they destroyed the social cohesion necessary for civilizational maintenance. The system essentially eats itself.
The destruction was mathematically embedded in the act of greed itself.
This makes me think of how the elites actually try to manage this inevitable collapse because, again, they aren't stupid. They know they're extracting, they know it causes friction, and they know people are getting angry.
Oh, they know.
Which brings us to an incredible, truly chilling detail in the broader narrative, the Syndicate of Nine.
Yes, the Syndicate of Nine. This is where we see the mechanics of oligarchy fully exposed in the text. It mentions a syndicate of 9 powerful individuals in the city who plot a secret operation, a mekar.
They plan a nighttime assassination of Saleh and his closest followers. And what is so wild about this is the specific detail of their plan. They agree beforehand to swear an oath to Saleh's heirs that they had absolutely no knowledge of the assassination.
They pre-plan their own alibi.
Right. They construct plausible deniability before they even commit the violence.
And we have to ask a critical question here as systems analysts.
Yeah.
Why? Why do they need to be so secretive? These are the elites. They control the water. They live in the impenetrable mountain palaces. They have all the power and wealth.
Exactly.
Why sneak around at night to kill one auditor and then lie about it? I mean, if you own the whole board, why hide your moves?
It's the paradox of overwhelming power. If you have a monopoly on violence, why not just use it in broad daylight?
Because systemic corruption, in order to function long-term, requires the illusion of legitimacy. If the elites openly murder anyone who asks for a fair audit of the water supply, the sheer naked brutality of their monopoly is exposed to the masses instantly.
The veil drops.
It shatters the social conditioning that keeps the lower classes compliant. The masses would instantly realize the system is not some natural order, but a rigged game enforced by violence. And they would revolt.
So they need it to look like a tragedy, or a mystery, or an accident. They have to preserve the illusion that the system is basically fair and just, even as they brutally defend their monopoly in the dark.
Exactly.
It reminds me of modern corporate or political cover-ups. A massive corporation knowingly dumps toxins into a local water supply, but they spend millions on PR campaigns about sustainability while secretly hiring lawyers to crush the whistleblowers in closed-door arbitrations.
It's the exact same
Exact same secret operation of plausible deniability.
The mechanics of oligarchy have not changed at all. They must hide the violence inherent in their economic enclosure. But this is where the law of requital closes the trap. The text makes it incredibly clear that the very destruction they plot in secret ultimately seals the fate of their own extractive architecture.
How so?
Well, they think they're being clever, pulling strings in the dark and pre-planning their oaths of ignorance. But their need for secrecy proves that their system cannot survive sunlight. Their assassination plot is the final structural stressor that causes the already fragmented society to completely shatter.
Let's pull all of this together into a grand synthesis. We've gone incredibly deep into this one case study of the Thamud and Saleh, but Parwez's analysis of Surah 26 places this within a much larger framework of systemic failures. We see different prophets dealing with different civilizational bugs.
Right. For example, you have Noah's case study earlier in the text, which is fundamentally about epistemological suppression.
Let's define that for the listener, because epistemological suppression is a heavy term. What does that actually look like in practice?
It is when a society flat out refuses to process factual information because those facts threaten their foundational worldview. It's a systemic refusal to learn or adapt. If a society cannot agree on basic reality, it cannot coordinate a response to a crisis, and it drowns.
Ah, I see.
Then you have the case of the Ad civilization, which was about the delusion of physical permanence and unchecked imperial overreach, the belief that sheer military and architectural size could insulate a society from consequences.
But the Thamud and Saleh case study, this is the most economically precise episode in the entire text. It is entirely about economic enclosure. It is a forensic study of a civilization converting common productive resources into private, monopolized property, and the mathematical collapse that follows.
The she-camel is not a religious symbol. It's just not. It is a property rights test disguised as a sign. The test was simple, the failure was absolute, and the structural consequence was proportionate. Parwez's reading of this episode sits within his larger argument that the economic ethics presented in this text are not a supplement to a spiritual system. They aren't just a footnote about being nice to the poor while you focus on your personal salvation.
They are the core of the social operating code. The fundamental economic crime is not individual fraud, like someone stealing a loaf of bread.
No.
The crime that brings down civilizations is the privatization of the productive commons. The Thamud did not fail a supernatural test. They failed the most basic test of whether their social system could organize resources in the interests of the entire community rather than the vested interests of the powerful few.
They chose the elite. And by choosing to enclose the commons to protect the elite, they literally chose civilizational suicide. The law of requital ensured that their extraction destroyed their own foundation.
If you are listening to this, I want you to carry this framework with you as you look at the world today. We are living through the creeping privatization of public water rights across the globe.
It's happening everywhere.
We are witnessing the massive enclosure of the digital commons, where shared human knowledge and data are harvested, monopolized, and sold back to us by a tiny syndicate of corporations. We're seeing the privatization of the very code and infrastructure that runs our daily lives.
The architecture of extraction looks different today than it did in those ancient mountains, but the underlying physics of the monopoly are identical.
So as you go about your week, ask yourself, what is the she-camel of our modern civilization? And are we quietly hamstringing it in the dark right now?
Because if the operating system is the same, the law of requital has not changed. The structural reckoning is still baked right into the code.
We will see you on the next deep dive.